Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first ever Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast live stream. As usual, I am the death metal guy, here with the black metal guy in a live format for the first time ever. We're very bad at this and have never done this before, so please let us know if anything is fucked up about the audio or the video. But, yeah. Black metal guy, we made it. We're super cool fucking live streamers now. We can get like soon we'll have like VTuber anime cat girl avatars and shit like that. I think it's gonna be pretty tight.
Yeah. We could let patrons vote for the characteristics of each of our cat girl.
I think no, it's like because I actually originally thought it would be like get you like a cool fucking like black metal VTuber avatar, and then I just get like the anime cat girl, and I just act like I don't know how it got that way and I can't fix it.
Imagine what you would get if it was cool black metal VTuber. like imagine what I mean. Presumably you'd ask AI or something, right? Like cool black metal VTuber, and it would be like, I don't know, like an anime bitmoji satanic skinhead.
Well, I'm sure you could get some like Indonesian to make one for you for like $8. You know?
Yeah, a deeply personal Gravelandian avatar. I thought you were going to use the gorilla, which Hyper Shaman used for the last short we did, and I got ready. I was going to use the Ahulabrum Squatch cover.
Oh, that would be solid. Well, yeah, this one, this first one, we did a little fly-by-night. The next one, we'll do some of the organization. I'll do some custom graphics and shit, and, learn how to do it. Do the whole, like, hot dog party, ice cream so yummy thing over and over. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So. Oh, yeah. Those are weird, man.
Oh, yeah. Man. Yeah, it's the only thing I jerk off to anymore. Porno. Yeah, I'm trying to get in touch with the youth. Porno doesn't do it for me. Now it's just ice cream so good and shit over and over.
Yeah, I feel like someone's gonna clip that out of context.
Feel free.
But no. I'm trying to get in touch with the youth. But yeah. So I mean, here's some. In addition to other planning out loud things. What do you think about Terminus? I think we got to get a new logo at some point soon.
I mean, what? Because my ex-wife made this one.
That could be a factor. It depends, really. It depends on how you feel about that.
But I don't give a shit. I mean, it's up to you. I mean, we could do that.
We could get some fucking grim logo or something. I like our existing logo, but it's very idiosyncratic.
I think that's one of the things that I like about it is like, usually nowadays when I'm getting art done for like a band or some project of mine or something, I'm usually trying to go for people who don't do metal art. Because I don't know, you can give them examples. I want someone from outside of it trying to imitate it because it usually comes up with weird stuff that you wouldn't usually see, but that's just me.
Yeah, no, we could look to a non-metal person. I have no idea who does logos. Also for planning out loud, what do you think about the idea of turning our Omega episode into a live stream? We should definitely do that. What do the people think about that?
Yeah, do you guys want to bro out?
If you want to tune in for a Terminus Omega live stream, I will. I mean, the death metal guy can't join you, but I will drink the whole time.
Oh yeah, this will be my first fully sober Terminus Omega. I don't even know if I'm psychologically prepared for that.
Have you cut out weed too?
Yeah, I quit smoking weed too, like a couple weeks ago. I have like no pleasures in life anymore apart from like vaping and I don't know, caffeine occasionally. That's about it.
Do you feel you're sort of do you feel your sort of undissipated viria condensing?
Oh, I knew you were gonna. It was gonna be something like that. Now, here's the thing: when people say, "Oh, I got sober and I feel so much better," it's fucking bullshit. Like those changes happen on such a long timeline that you don't notice it at all. It's like I can look back and be like, "Well, I'm not hungover all the time," or like I'm not tired because I'm smoking weed all the time. But for the most part, it's like, just kind of fucking doing it.
The major benefit is just not doing the thing that you decided was bad for you.
Yeah, pretty much. Although I will say I played a show the other day because I've lost a shit ton of weight now from just cleaning up my lifestyle. And it didn't really click until I saw a video from that show. And I saw myself on stage, and it's like, holy shit, this actually did do something. I guess losing 50 pounds actually does make a difference. Who would have thought?
Yeah, very cool.
So, we definitely we should talk about the idea of doing, because I think that the sort of like chaotic multi-hour Omega episode as a live stream would really work. Yeah.
And then after that, we can finally tackle the thing that we've bandied about as a joke after we finish segments, which is the eventual Terminus reviews every Marduk album live stream until we drop.
God damn. Didn't we figure out that was like 16 albums or something the other day?
Yes, it's 16 records. You know what? I heard the new one. It's good.
Oh, I haven't gotten around to it. My buddies are listening to it, and they say that it's good. And I'm like, I'll take your word for it. I'll get to it eventually.
It's, it is actually quite good. I mean, I will, every time a new Marduk record comes out, I'll check a few tracks and get a sense for what the vibe is on the record. And I haven't been super interested in any of the ones they've put out since that I've caught since, God, I don't know, Serpent's Sermon or something.
Mm-hmm.
But but this one is quite good. It sounds it's got Mortuous's fingerprints all over it, which means it sounds like the last Funeral Mist, and Sigurblot, of which he was totally not a member.
Yeah.
So there are actually some kind of more sort of pagan sounding epic riffs on there.
Well, I mean, that sounds good. I mean, have you not been following the newer World War II albums, like Victoria and shit?
Not really. I listened to a track off it and was like, oh, okay. So there was some punky stuff on it that was cool. What did you think of it?
I think it's pretty good. I've just heard parts of it. The drummer in one of my bands is really into those newer ones like Frenchwine and Victoria. And they sound really good. I mean, it seems like Marduk have modes for their albums where they choose the aesthetic and then the music fits that. So, you've got Marduk in Satan mode, you've got them in World War II mode, you've got them in sort of mystical occult mode. And so the World War II ones, the newer ones, do sound sort of updated, polished, streamlined Panzer Division. So, I mean, I think that's cool in and of itself.
Yeah, no, they're an inherently extremely solid band, right? You want to look at the bands that have never the bands from the very beginning that have never sold out. Clearly Marduk is up there. But yeah, the new one actually sounds a little bit different from the Panzer Division continued format. I remember Serpent's Sermon was Panzer Division and showy Orthodox, which also worked pretty well.
Yeah.
But Memento Mori, is someone in the chat, Landfish screams, has it dawned on you yet? I think that's from one of the tracks. It's themed around medieval Memento Mori. And it's got this cool chants, just reminding listeners in classic punk fashion, you're gonna die.
No, I mean, that sounds good. I think for me, it's just Marduk is one of those bands that just sort of exists in the background, and I pop in and check on them periodically. It's I like Marduk a lot, but they've never been central to my listening.
For sure.
I just I get there here and there.
After we finished the last 2 shows and it was like live stream coming up, I was like, now I have luxury. I can listen to whatever I want. I can indulge my whim to listen to the new Marduk record.
I just use it as an opportunity to listen to the same 7 albums I've been listening to for the past 20 years. So. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think I listened to Pentagram the other day. I listened to Devourment.
Nice.
I think I listened to like Gateways to Annihilation. Just gotta recharge the batteries with all that shit periodically.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, like, just working my way through shit that I would, stuff that's like sort of classic, but I would never actually think to listen to. Old Sweet Death stuff. Just a lot of like classic death metal shit, or like second tier classic death metal shit that I'm not really that into, but I want as sort of background knowledge. I was listening to My Dying Bride the other day just to refresh my memory. So I was listening to some of the old albums no one talks about, like The Angel in the Dark River. A lot of my time when I'm not listening to stuff for the show is either just classic stuff that I always listen to, or it's me trying to brush up on more like early 90s knowledge that just I didn't get to at one point or another.
Yeah, for sure. Sure.
I'm a responsible academic about my fucking...
No, I do that too, for sure. Maybe not as systematically, but I like that. I got I was talking to, I don't know if he'll be watching this, because I don't know if he's a patron, but the guy Black Death Horizon is in his Instagram account, and he's friends with all the Bunsen burner dudes.
Yeah.
We were talking about Graveland, and he was like, I said Immortal Pride sucked, and he said it was his favorite record and by them. And so I had to go back and listen to it in terms of refreshing the classics. That one is really quite good, because you have all of the arrangement and composition tendencies in the later stage Dark and Solo stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All sort of epic Bathorian Graveland with this narrative tendency in a lot of the songs, and almost like exaggerated. You would really like it because it's hyper narrative, kind of in the way that the last record was, but it still has Capricornus in the band. So you have just the ape shit fumbling drumming and the extremely raw tone and some of the more, droning aggressive guitar stuff with bombastic keyboards and this kind of like operatic plot arc to the record. He also just keeps slamming that Eagles screaming key.
Yeah, I know. Like, old Graveland is something I gotta go back to and like listen to all those records, because it's like I've heard Thousand Swords and Carpathian Wolves, but just like a couple times over the course of a lot of years. My cat is knocking all of my things off of my kitchen counter right now, if anyone's hearing the noises from the other room. So
yeah, that's it's the perfect time.
Yeah, exactly. No, she's being very disruptive. Anyway, so we don't really know how to do these, but Black Metal Guy, you had an idea for like an initial thing to talk about, a sort of like starting topic that we'll branch off of. I gave the guys in the Discord a quick hint about that, but what have you got?
Oh yeah, I mean, I just figured we would start with one of the old sort of, I don't know, bar conversation gimmies. Keyboards in metal. I guess.
Yeah. Oh, real quick. It's Apples. Actually, it's Apples being disruptive rather than Wilkins, who's peacefully sleeping next to me. That's a big surprise. But anyway,
a kinky role reversal.
Exactly. So, keyboards in metal. Just like whether they're acceptable or not.
Well, I mean, we probably both agree they're acceptable. But what are our feelings about keyboards? So there was a God, the Hell's Headbangers guy has been killing it with all of his solo YouTube uploads lately.
Yeah.
And another thing that he did that I thought was genuinely like watch all the way through quality. Like his individual rants are cool, but like the interviews are awesome. And he did one with Dawn of the Dead from Nunslaughter and the guy from Cyanide. And they were all just standing outside after a show drinking or
Mm-hmm.
something or at a festival. And it was just awesome, like fly on the wall experience. And they're just talking about, he asks them both keyboards and metal, and they're both keyboards and death metal, and they're both just like gay, right? And they totally bro out about it. But the it's it is one of those things that everyone has an opinion on. Then they went on to say keyboards in metal and classic rock were okay, but not death metal and probably not black metal, I would guess.
I think I think the keyboard question is, it's like you said up front. It's like I think we'd both say it's acceptable. Well, it's like I think it's acceptable in that there are some bands or some individuals who are especially good at using them, but I think that it's like I think it's a matter of knowing the rules in order to break them, and I think that rule is that there shouldn't be keyboards in metal for the most part. Like I think that in general, I mean, I'll get into it, but it's like I've been talking to my girlfriend about this lately, about how if a metal band is not fundamentally oriented around the riff, the electric guitar riff as its like fundamental unit of song structure, you're starting to get away from metal. And in most cases, I think people would be better served hewing closer to it. Now, there's certainly guys who make stuff like synths or folk instruments, what have you, work really well, but I think it's the exception to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I think that it tends to be imitative of other things in a lot of cases. I don't think that it adds a ton to most bands where it's prominent. I think that the exceptions to that are those who are able to pull from other styles of music and successfully incorporate that into a riff-based song structure. But for the most part, it's like, if you get to, let's say, something like symphonic black metal, I don't know how much of it is like strictly necessary to those songs.
Yeah, Hessian says, imagine Dimmu Borgir with no keyboards, and it's like, yeah, that's what I hear when I hear Dimmu Borgir, and it's terrible.
Yeah, I'm
Right?
imagining no Dimmu Borgir, and that sounds fine to me.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Without keyboards, they would sound like chord progressions,
Yeah.
right?
And then he
Um,
followed up by talking about Hivis Lasataras not working without keys. Yeah, but we're also talking about Varg, who's probably one of the top 5 geniuses that's ever
yeah,
operated in metal.
yeah.
And
I might, yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
he's pulling keyboards like and its utility from like Kosmish music. He's not merely attempting to recreate like prog rock keyboard styles or
Well,
soundtrack music keyboards.
I think that's important. It really helps if you're familiar with, um, if you're using keyboards, you need to understand that they're an electronic instrument and that you're dealing with electronic textures and how to work within that medium and embrace it. Uh, the weakness of the thing that makes Emperor's early record, the most orchestrated early records, the not age as well as they could, despite the core songwriting, is these kinds of like 90s digital synth patches that they're using to just meticulously imitate orchestra voices, right? The keyboard stuff on that Burzum did or that Mortis did is much more in tune with like what can you do with keys. Um, Mortis uses like trumpet sounds or whatever, but they're not trying to sound like trumpets. Um, the um, I think for me, I might be a little more pro key than you then.
Probably, yeah.
But I would see, I guess what I can say is I saw the keyboards were a big part of what, um, or at least they were a big part of my impression of black metal at the beginning.
I think it
Like
is for a lot of people.
yeah, hearing Emperor, it was just like hearing the Emperor, the Hordanes land material for Emperor. It was just I heard riffing that I could immediately associate with stuff that I was like only just getting into, like Discharge. Maybe I had heard Napalm Death by then, but yeah, mostly like Discharge and Slayer that were sort of colliding in this. I've talked about this on the show before, but this sort of the high and having the high and low components of the music as we stress over and over and over again on the show, you can literally hear that spatialized in the arrangements of the pre-Nightside Emperor, right? There's just grinding, almost death metal guitars for the most part, right? And there's with the crushing bass tone, and there are these lofty neoclassical keys, and hearing that at the same time, I think because I'd come at it from a punk background, it was like I was feeling a taboo broken in a way that was deeply appealing. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no, because something interesting,
Maybe.
something interesting happens here. Because I was thinking about that while you were talking earlier. In that, like, we make this like long hair, short hair distinction all the time. With the idea being that, like, I come from this sort of long hair background of like classic and prog rock. That's what I grew up with, and then getting into, but then like over time getting into new metal and then into extreme metal and then sort of having to work my way back into classic heavy metal. Whereas you come from this like short hair background of like punk and goth music, and then you sort of get into this long hair territory of like sort of elaborate black metal and stuff that plays on these more high art leanings in a lot of cases. So we both started at one place and then discovered the other.
Yeah, and
so,
also,
so for you hearing the keyboards is sort of like this intense reaction to this thing that you grew up with and you kind of cut your teeth on.
yeah, exactly. Whereas for you, it might just be like, oh, this sounds like my dad's classic rock records, right?
Yeah,
Or,
kind
this
of
sounds
that.
like video game music.
Yeah, well, I mean, even the video game music thing is like. So I here's one of my major issues with keyboards. I was saying earlier, it's like a lot of the time it strikes me as like a pretension to something else. Because obviously plenty of people in the chat here have examples of bands that use keyboards really well. And those are like all good examples. But the reality is we're still talking about 2% of like the metal bands that use keyboards, because the vast majority of metal bands that use keyboards are like power metal schlock or like bad synth black or bad atmo black that's ripping off summoning. It's like the instances of shitty keyboard usage are so rife throughout extreme metal, we don't even notice them anymore.
And they're proliferating now, say, in the this whole world of neo dungeon synth, which I think is just completely different from old dungeon synth for the most part. It's like been captured by like punk scene gamer people, because it has that sort of whimsical aesthetic. They're really into that. And there's black metal being made in that idiom now, right? This sort of summoning style. Is it black metal? Is it dungeon synth stuff? And there's all sorts of just like, sort of just either like completely canned sounds being used in these contexts, right? You just download like the dungeon synth patches to use, and stuff and samples pre-canned, and it's also often just like cutesy schlock.
And what's interesting about the failure of dungeon synth is that it's a failure of the thing that it seeks to imitate because it misinterprets what it was seeking to imitate. So I would say that, people can talk about Dungeon Synth being, about ambient music or about neoclassical music, what have you. What it really is PC video game soundtracks from the 90s. But if you actually go back and listen to the music in Infinity Engine RPGs, your Baldur's Gate, your Icewind Dale, your Planescape Torment, any sort of these games, they don't sound like they're attempting to ape classical music. They sound sort of fascinating and originary, specifically because, like, there wasn't an equivalent. There's some sort of imitation of probably 80s fantasy films or something, but there were no video games to imitate, and you didn't have a soundtrack to your D&D session when you were a kid. So what you get is something that's kind of like classical music and kind of like folk music and kind of like ambient, but what it really is a sort of imagined soundtrack to something that had not existed prior to that point. And that's why a lot of that stuff is so cool. And that's why a lot of video game music sucks now, is because they're imitating. Now they have the technology and the budgets to more directly imitate, like, movie scores and stuff like that. So basically, Dungeon Synth has missed the point of what it's trying to imitate, because there was nothing for it to imitate in its original form in, PC RPG soundtracks.
It's and on the other side of, like, PC game soundtracks, right, you have Heroes of Might and Magic soundtracks, which literally do imitate classical music, often with a film inflection, and do it with a musical skill that's beyond the capacity of anyone but, like, Mortis or, Varg.
That's fair. It does imitate classical music, but it's also different due to inherent technological limitations. Like, there's a lot of stuff from Heroes of Might and Magic 3. There's music that I can very distinctly remember, but you also have to remember that, like, those town themes are oriented around, like, 1 to 2 minute loops because of memory limitations at the time. They had to create something bite-sized and immediately memorable, which immediately takes it away from classical music because it can't operate on the same time scale. And, like we were saying on the show, quantity is a form of quality. It fundamentally changes it.
That's true. I guess what I'm saying is the kinds of melodies and chord structures and key changes and the sheer density of melodic material on those is really evokes classical music to a degree. Most metal that references it doesn't, and certainly most Dungeon Synth that references it doesn't. So I guess I'm saying in the material that's being imitated, there's I'm just pointing to a different side of video game soundtracks that does sound more kind of classically, but not in a Dungeon Synthy way.
That's fair, but
they have there's something deliberately stilted about most of this modern Dungeon Synth stuff, whereas Heroes of Might and Magic, the soundtrack is there's a sort of intense musical capability to it.
I think that's fair, but I think that there is something also stilted about a lot of the PC game music, and I think that that's almost one of its appeals to me, is the sort of awkwardness of it. I mean, we have to keep in mind that, nowadays, video game studios can afford to hire composers and full orchestras and stuff, but back in the 90s, a lot of these guys are just, your buddy who played around on his Casio at home, self-taught guys who were, like, in the manner of the best black metal, guys with a relatively low level of technical skill but a lot of vision and a relatively limited palette of tools at their disposal, trying to create something that outstrips its own limitations. Even really famed video game composers, look at like Nobuo Uematsu, who's kind of the main musical guy behind the entire Final Fantasy series. That's not a guy who had formal music education, as far as I know. But from the early days of doing chiptune stuff on the NES to essentially conducting orchestras later down the road, creating these sprawling, kind of really cool pieces, part of what makes video game music interesting and makes it distinct from the classical tradition is the relative lack of formal education.
For sure. So wait, let me make sure I'm getting right what you're saying about Dungeon Synth. Uh,
Yeah, go ahead.
you're saying that I'm pausing to think. You're saying that because the people in the 90s did not have any precedent for what they were doing, and they had to create something new they were either literally, I mean, I'm not sure if you're talking about if you're including Mortis and Burzum and all the various like proto Dungeon Synth people.
No, because
you're saying that the main. I see. You're saying that the main source for modern Dungeon Synth is obviously not those things. It's video game music.
Yeah, so it's the same problem we see in any genre of music, where we are now Xeroxing a Xerox. Original dungeon. Let's call 90s PC game music original dungeon synth for the sake of argument, because it essentially is, like, in terms of the DNA of the genre. These guys create something out of whole cloth with very little to imitate or use as a reference point, so it becomes a genre that develops its own idioms that are a part of not just taste, but sort of technological limitations at the time. Then Zoomers in the late 2010s and early 2020s start imitating these things, but they have something to draw from. And as a result, what you get is sort of a rote copying of these ideas without understanding that those ideas existed because they come from a very specific point in time, without common reference points, and without the same sort of expansive technological possibilities that we have today.
Yeah, as you always say, right? They were trying to do the best they could with what they had in the time, right? Rather than make something that is intentionally cute by being fumbly. What else? So we were talking about the point I wanted to make about the Emperor thing was just I sort of got it, but then we immediately tangented. It's just you can hear the quote low art in the guitar part and the high art quote in the keyboards at the same time, and it just everything I had thought about keyboards being gay and prog rock nonsense and whatever just went out of the window in that context. But then you hear the keys on the next two records and you're like, I'm not so sure about these, because there's a huge difference between those. Obviously they're string patches on the first on Hordane's Land and stuff. They're string patches, but they're played as synths. They have high delay, they swirl, they sound mystical and kind of raw and distant. And then after that, you get these really crisp, modern patches that sound like cheap cubist imitations of an orchestra.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know if I've said it in so many words on the show, but I guess I'll make it clear. It's like the problem for me with Emperor is like really early Emperor rules, Wrath of the Tyrant, Hordane's Land, the Emperor EP. Those are all awesome. But the problem is that Isan always... I firmly believe that the shit you get from later Emperor is what Isan always wanted. And that's the problem. Yeah. It's like the success of early Emperor it's almost a mistake. It's due to the limitations of...
And due to the greater involvement of Mortis and Samoth at that time.
Well, yes, that's certainly a part of it, too. I think that Isan always had his eye on the ball. Isan always, to me, always fantasized being like a composer for movies or something like that. I mean, you can hear that on his solo work.
And that's also the big problem with his vocals, which is why it's threw clean vocals off for a long time, because he thought in order to sing he had to imitate some sort of opera voice, and it's grown on me over time because I can just accept it is what it is, but I found it a little cringe when I first heard it because he's kind of straining his voice, and it doesn't come naturally to him, and it's a good example of it's great to be inspired by opera vocals, but how can you do that in a way that sounds natural to a screaming heavy metal song?
Well, that's Attila.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure. He has the technical skill to do it, and he's not. Yeah. Yeah. Attila does it much better. Or Pest on Under the Sign of Hell,
Yeah.
where he does one song that's just fully sang Prophet's Openbaring, or mostly sang, and it's awesome.
Well, yeah, high technical skill in clean vocals tends to be like a limiting factor. Honestly, we could have exactly the same conversation about clean vocals in extreme metal.
Yes.
It's like you have to know the rules in order to break them. And, when we talk about it, I mean, you and I can both probably think of 50 examples off the top of our head of awesome clean vocals in extreme metal, but that's because our brain is blocking out the thousands of instances of it fucking sucking,
And because the truly great albums are often those where somebody knows the rules well enough to break them, right?
Yeah.
It's you become the exception that confirms the rule. Anyway, we have some people in the chat saying shit. The chat is now dead, which is interesting.
They're intrigued by our autism. They're excited.
That's right. They can't take their brains away from. They can't stop the type. Someone asks, Keller synth or dungeon synth? I live in a world. I think what I want to do is never learn what Keller synth means.
Keller synth is just.
I eventually had to learn what synthwave meant, and it made me very upset. So, do I want to know what Keller synth is?
Keller synth is just all the BSOD knockoff stuff. Like that guy, BSOD, the German dude that did like Corneus and all those other projects that are like drum machine distorted synth and a bunch of yelping vocals.
So it's dungeon synth.
But
it's like specifically Grouse and Kite worship.
Yes, it's that kind of thing.
Oh God, yeah, I would just call that dungeon synth. Like,
well, he's saying no now, so I don't know what does Keller synth mean in this case. I mean, I would say like at least insofar as all the sort of Grouse and Kite worship stuff goes, I've encountered a couple projects that are fun, but like who gives a shit? It's a dead end of a style. It's not going to produce anything really special. The coolest stuff sounds like fumbling imitations of the Castlevania soundtrack, which is cool, and there's a place for that, but there's a place for like 3 of those, not 200. So
yeah, well, hopefully explains more what he means. Herr Dud says Vargrave is pretty good with synth, if you guys have heard it. They're spoken of very highly. I remember the guy who did that hipster black metal channel talked about Vargrave a lot. I mean, it did not strike me when I first heard it.
I don't think I've heard Vargrave. As far as like weird synth-based stuff that is cool, I would go to I think it was it Ceremonial Castings from the United States, which just has really wild, overdone synth stuff that's pretty tight.
Vargrave is supposed to be like sort of pretty religious emperor worship. And this goes back to what we were saying. Basically, another point is that to be a good keyboard band, you have to have, it doesn't have to be guitar centric, but there has to be something worthwhile in the guitar parts. I think you basically have to earn your orchestration by having a solid architecture to the songs. And the early Vargrave I heard, he understood that there was this really heavy kind of grinding undertone to the keyboard parts in early Emperor, but it didn't have the riffy quality to it. Is what struck me. It was leaning too hard on the keyboards. Now, that could have changed. I hear he's got a new one coming out. Maybe we'll review it, because it's almost like modern canon now, but I wasn't that impressed by the stuff I heard before.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, do we need Emperor imitation? Like, I mean,
No.
I argue, do we need symphonic black metal at all? I think that well has run pretty dry, and for the most part, I have not been impressed by most of the bands seeking to bring that up again. We've covered a few records on the show that were pretty cool. Okay, so like the White Rune record was neat. Again, it sounds like black metal plus sort of RPG soundtrack stuff. It's cool. I haven't gone back to it. The newer Satanic Warmaster that's teased some of those ideas out, it's been cool, but like those records without the keyboards, I think would probably be just as good.
Yeah.
It just like there's not a lot out there unless someone really changes the way that. Landfish, Obtained Enslavement is actually the band I was thinking of, not Ceremonial Castings. Old Obtained Enslavement. Yeah, Old Obtained Enslavement is bizarre because it's USBM from like the mid to late 90s.
Obtained Enslavement is Norwegian.
Are they? Oh, God damn it. Who am I thinking of then? Hold on. Let me try and figure this out.
Pest for who was in Gorgoth was in Obtained Enslavement.
Okay, I'm tripping. No, I was thinking of...
you were thinking of Ceremonial Castings.
I believe I was.
Which was sort of very competent, earnest emperor worship.
Mm-hmm.
Which unfortunately somehow spawned Uwa'ada.
I think I might have also been thinking of Summon, if you remember them.
That's a cool name.
I believe Summon, or I might be thinking of something else entirely. Anyway, I was listening to something the other day, which is like mid to late 90s USBM with totally gorked, like overdone keyboard stuff, like 3 layers of hyperspeed synth arpeggios going on at all times. But it was really cool. But okay, so how much juice is there left in synth black, really? Like, and I'm not talking about shit. Who is that Italian band who I really loved that you brought on to the show?
Oh, Solitudo.
Solitudo. Okay, Solitudo is clearly after something different. That's not like symphonic black metal.
No, we don't mean by synth black. We don't mean having keyboards. I mean, I wouldn't consider any of the Latter Day Graveland records synth black that have keyboards. No. I don't know. There's all sorts of. I think that's a good. I think basically yes. I think attempting to make symphonic black metal now has something. It has the problem of retro pastiche or anachronism. That is, it's like you are. If you're trying to directly imitate it, you're missing the point, which is that it was a developmental moment in black metal. The way you could look at it is, the record that has been very good, A Tygar, was very good. That was really good.
That was more your thing than mine. I didn't really get that one, but I'll trust your judgment.
It is kind of like an exercise in a vanished voice. I'm not sure. It's hard to hear exactly how you would carry that style forward. They were listening to the other band everyone is forgetting to mention in the chat, or unless somebody's already said it, is Kvist, which is probably the perfect symphonic black metal thing. It's that record has aged much better than Emperor, even than the earliest Emperor stuff, in that you have fully developed black metal guitar technique integrated with neoclassical keyboards that are played like keyboards, but that have an ear for like the modern edge of classical music to them.
Yeah.
It's just a perfect album. A Tygar gets a lot of mileage out of imitating that, but even that is maybe you can learn a lot from Emperor or Kvist and translate it into black metal, but doing it within the artificial conceit of synth black is a bad idea. Symphonic black metal was like a label that was basically smashed onto Emperor, right? And then a bunch of other bands spin up like imitating that. But what I would say was happening is by having the separate epic keyboard and grinding guitar lines, Emperor was identifying the two aspects that they wanted black metal to be in sonic space, and they were sort of isolated from each other. And then what happens is that the successive bands integrate them, bring them into like a sort of seamless vocabulary. Gorgoroth, right? The guitars are doing both of those things at once.
Yeah, or as Landfish just brought up, Abigor, their usage of keyboards is very effective. But what I would say, Abigor goes about it in a really smart way, in that even as cool as some of their keyboard stuff is, it's never designed to be a central voice. In terms of like governing the song structure, because previously someone brought up Cradle of Filth as being a good example of keyboards in black metal, and it's true, but the way Cradle of Filth uses keyboards is pretty interesting, because as cool as some of their keyboard parts are, again, like Abigor, they're never the central thing you remember about a song, and they're primarily used as like interstitial material connecting these sort of these long sections of riffing. You know, longer Cradle of Filth songs always operate like suites, and usually the way they transition from one part of the suite to another is with like a keyboard passage. So these little atmospheric interludes that you could almost break out as separate little like 1.5 minute tracks. So I think their usage of it is very effective, but it's also very different from the admirable but misguided attempt of a lot of synth black bands to have the synths be like a constant voice that is of equal importance to the guitars.
Yeah, if that's our principle for synth black, that's a good definition of what it is, right? You're trying to put the keyboards on an equal footing, if not more, and you're doing it with a eye towards a specific kind of a classical, big scare quotes ideal for the composition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of that connects back to this. I mean, something that I want to get in, because I don't know if I've ever had the opportunity to do this like full rant on the show, which is like the metal band's aspiration to neoclassical, like, continues to drive me fucking insane, and it has for like 20 years now. Like, I don't understand the need. It's as though there's so many metal bands who think that, like, the ultimate triumph of their music is being taken seriously by, like, I don't know, classical musicians, like high art nerds. I don't understand what the impulse is.
Yeah, I mean, I would think there's much less of that now. Now that there are so many people in metal from really, you know what it is? That's a metal problem that comes from the classic. That's like a classic long hair problem.
Yeah.
And I feel like there must proportionately be a lot less of it in the scene now.
I think, no, because it still exists. Like, it still definitely exists. Because that is the thing that gets you. Trained opera singer reacts to Slaughter to Prevail videos that get like 2 million views on YouTube.
Oh, you're thinking of, okay, so you're talking about much broader than the kind of shit we talk about.
Yeah, but it's like,
yeah.
Like, I would assume, that problem must exist to some degree, even in our shit, even if it's smaller proportionally. It's oh god, metal is modern classical, man. Yeah, god, I fucking hate that shit, dude. It's just there is this perpetual insecurity that I see in metal that produces stuff like that. And
I think that's a broader issue, right? People love these reaction clips of like anyone from anything that isn't metal liking metal. Hip hop guys like metal. Oh my god, they get it. See, this proves we were cool.
Yeah, it's nerd. It's high school nerd shit that like perpetuates itself. It
also is that inferior aspect of the metal scene that sort of it wants to be understood, right? Like you can immediately ignore anyone who says, man, people say metal shows are such hostile places to go, full of violence and gatekeeping. But when I go, everyone is so nice. Metalheads are the friendliest people I know. anyone who like gives you that line is just like, oh, wow, great.
It's this desperate need for mainstream approval, which I don't. You see, I don't know. I think that like, so for me, if I take like a really like high up bird's eye view of what I'm into about extreme metal, it is that I like that it's a sort of rigorously structured form of experimental music. Like, you know, like a lot of the things that I'm listening to in my free time legitimately is stuff like Enmity and Last Days of Humanity, or, you know, really scratchy Black Legions, black metal, that sort of thing. That's the thing that I've always been most drawn to. One of the reasons that I got into extreme metal, you know, I went from being a kid that listened to nu metal and went straight into death metal, and from there, I was always looking for sort of the most extreme and atonal and bizarre stuff that I could find. You know, the idea that we were attempting to, you know, it always smacks of an insecurity of like, one day we'll be able to make real music. You know, like people who do classical makes, you know. Like, I don't understand it, and it makes me wonder, it's like, am I really at odds with like a huge chunk of this scene? Because I think that the longer I've been in it, the more I've realized, wow, there aren't that many people who like this because it's heavy. You know, it's sort of like, you know, the stupid question asked at a right time thing. It's like, power electronics. Why do you like music that's about, you know, serial killers and rape and terrorism and stuff? And I'm like, because I think it's cool to do music about those things. I think that they're pretty neat, you know? Like,
yeah. Landfish asks, can one jump the fuck up while listening to BM? I think if you mean hardcore dancing in general, then yes. I mean, talk about the first Emperor EP. If you mean or would Death Metal Guy and I were talking about, you know, how the no mosh, no core, no fun is totally a lie, right? There's mosh all over DMDS. I think in terms of nu metal Jinko bassist dance, absolutely not. Right. I think if you're properly jumping to fuck up, you need to jump to fuck out.
So, and Fume are talking about jazz a little bit, and is asking if it's the same impulse with jazz and metal. I think to some degree. I think that if we're looking at like early 90s prog death stuff, if we're looking at like Cynic or Atheist, and you're asking the question of whether they had pretensions of being like high acceptable art, yeah, I think that is true. However, I think that I think that for modern stuff, like the leading edge of jazz in metal now is really extreme brutal death metal. And a lot of those guys either A, just have legitimate jazz backgrounds, like the guys in Defeated Sanity or Nikhil from Anal Stab Wound, or they're just using these techniques to make their own music more extreme and atonal. So I think that if we're talking about jazz in metal, I think that we're talking about a couple different impulses, and I think nowadays the guys that are into fusing those things are doing it more as an asset for extremity. This not including shit like White Ward or, you know, whatever goofy post-black stuff has a saxophone now. But like in terms of serious jazz, Brutal Death is carrying that forward, and they're definitely not doing it with the intention of, you know, being approved of by someone in a conservatory somewhere.
Yeah, well, that gets back. So, yeah, because certainly jazz and metal was a huge problem in the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. I mean, you know, like Cynic or any of those bands. Yeah, there's a certain kind of metal musician, again, more mainstream, who really does crave validation. You know, the kind of guy who goes to the Berklee School of Music to like learn metal or whatever, right? Craves validation from jazz musicians.
Yeah.
Prog metal kind of crap that, you know, just doesn't end up on the show. With classical, I think I'm gonna say that yeah, I might have a slightly different take on it. I think that um I think what I think if you're, yeah, like superficial, if you're engaging in superficial mimesis of elements of classical music, right, you are trying to just pull off chunks of that into your music in this clumsy way in hope of being approved. That's almost always a bad thing. Um, but like I mean, I think like it's pretty fundamental to what we think of as modern black metal guitar technique. The just sliding harmonized chords, all of the cool melodies in black metal have to do with a classical and and folk background, but classical background. And the uh what I would see it as is you don't need to pander to classical music to be part of that tradition. I would almost say metal is having an inferiority. Metal is more connected to classical music than it realizes, in the sense that, have you heard any good classical music written in the last 60 years?
I mean, no, but I don't listen to classical music, so.
Yeah, but there's a reason you don't.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right?
Well,
Yeah,
it features no slams and no sick inhaled gutturals, so I don't think I understand the question.
right. I think a real limitation in I mean, well, I'll go there in a second, but like I think in a way the substance of the classical tradition, right, by which we mean everything from, I don't know, late medieval through early 20th century music, right? The substance of that was banished from the academy by 12-tone music and then replaced by nothing, right? Replaced by abstruse conceptual shit and by at this point, I don't know, like, the New York Philharmonic or whatever is playing the Black Panther soundtrack. So like no kidding. Someone sent me that headline the other day, but it's so at this point they are fumbling for they spiraled into sort of autistic formalism, not the good kind of autism, and now they're clutching after relevance. There basically is nothing. Those ideas of, say, forceful continuous melody, dense harmony, counterpoint, this outgrowth of this sort of more technically or compositionally elaborate derivations from folk music, continuity of from European monastic music and whatever. All of that, all of those things about classical music, or the sense of it as in some way sacred music, right? Very often liturgical music. All those aspects of classical music have been just completely banished from the centers of money and power that used to produce it. And were sort of necessary to producing it, right? You can't really have classical music without conservatories and without rich people who are supporting adventurous composers or whatever. Where that kind of music goes over the course of the 20th century is it flees into metal. And you can talk about weird things happening too with, say, like experimental music by John Cage, sort of setting up a kind of primitivism that you get from people like John Cale at the beginning of punk. But that's a slightly different strand of it. But basically, where real music, when real music is banished from high culture, it takes refuge in quote unquote low culture. And all the cool, hip, urbane people by the late 20th century, including the punks and whatever, knew to despise classical music as part of this sort of square, stuffy, excessively European heritage. And really and thought of attempting to imitate it as ahistorical or something, right? While meanwhile there were people that these guys looked down on as working class yobs who practiced guitar really hard and listened to classical music and spent hours trying to learn Flight of the Bumblebee on electric guitar, right? And I
Yeah.
feel like those are or, like the guys in Iron Maiden, right? Who clearly spent time listening to various kinds of classical music and folk music or whatever, and produced music that sounded nothing like that, right? And you can sit there cynically deriding them for it, but they produced something new because of that. Uh, and so it's sort of, I think there's a way that a kind of authentic and important high art tradition gets banished into low art and gets owned and transformed by people who are far outside the centers of learning and cultural capital. Uh, and eventually, you end up with something like Dawn, right? And there are ways that this music, because of its hybridization with, quote, low culture and avant-garde culture music, right? Because of its integration with the extreme music that begins with like the Stooges and all that, you get something that is both primitivistic and ornate, and that is classically learned, but also played as a folk tradition, and that continues that in a totally new way. And I mean, I would rather fucking listen to Slaughter Son than any classical record, and I just see them as part of the same tradition and a development of it. I think that's the strongest claim I would make for metal to classical music. You don't need to pander to the classical people or try to impress them, because you're already mogging them.
Yeah.
Like Slaughter Son, Crown of the Triarchy, Kvist, all of this is miles cooler than any academic music anybody's done in the last, since not long after Stravinsky. And if Stravinsky heard metal, he'd love it. That's my rant.
No, I think you make some good points. I appreciate you capturing like the essence of the idea being that the spirit lives on more than a specific sort of academic or technical background. But one last point that I want to make just on this idea is that when people talk about metal being referential or being indebted to classical music, that is like fundamentally true, but it's also missing the context to it being referential to a very, very small slice of classical music.
That's true.
Because there's basically two ways you take it. There's old school kind of Guitar Hero stuff that is very into Mozart and Bach, and well, Beethoven's the center of the Venn diagram here. And the other, which is like black metal, which is almost exclusively referential to like Wagner and like Holst. So when people talk about metal being, this supposed reincarnation of classical music, if anything, it's a reincarnation of an incredibly limited palette of classical music that is the biggest and the darkest and the coolest and the stuff that is most suitable for metal. Yeah.
It's a purification.
Yeah.
It because of the minimalist impulse inherited from other places, right? And it burns away a bunch of the things it doesn't need. It's only after very specific things. And some of that has to do with and although you can explain it in terms of accident, like, oh, that's all these guys had access to, it really is, what did they glom onto, even within an individual movement of a symphony?
Yeah, and right? It's Wagner. Like, every metalhead's favorite composer is Wagner.
It's Wagner, but it's also like the sick parts of Beethoven.
Right? Yeah.
Or if you want to hear some great, some of the stuff that comes closest to Slavonic black metal, listen to Smetana's Moldau or Dvorak's New World Symphony.
Yeah, I was about to say there's a lot of like There's a lot of Russian classical music
Yeah.
that'll sound a lot like black metal.
Check.
But we can't.
I've got a horse in that race, but
Eastern Bloc stuff
yes,
in general. But like also, people just need to remember that it's like classical music is like, because this is, the people who are the most intense about saying metal is super related to classical music are generally those with the least background in classical music, and who conveniently forget that like 85% of classical music historically is like gay court music or like liturgical music.
So this is what I was going to say, is that classical, like black metal is like the high black metal tradition is classical music without the gay parts. And it's been were studiously stripped away. And sorry, I'm trying to do that while talking about this while opening the door for my dog who's thumping his tail against the door, but no, it doesn't. Anyway, studiously stripped away. And like when classical, and you can see that as continuing a tendency that started it with the Romantics, actually, because classical per se, right, is 18th century court music, right, and Haydn or Mozart or whatever, and there are extreme strict. There are culturally. There were strictures on how the music was to be composed that were culturally significant at the time, and that had to do with, as you say, the rituals of court, with dancing, and with a kind of mood that, as part of this, you could say, decadent and overly refined aristocratic culture, was seen as, was seen as the highest kind of artistic experience, right? So, the constant key changes, lest you be too absorbed in one passion, right? The constant transformations of classical music are linked to a cognitive approach to music, where you're sort of dialectically leaping from one idea to the next. You're always, you're sure you're feeling the music, but you have to be constantly thinking it.
Yeah, or just the idea of, orchestral stuff being programmatic music, typically, designed to accompany a performance.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it was just you sit down and you watch the orchestra, but yeah, for sure. Also, there are ballets, or there are, or things we listen to now. I guess things we listen to now as standalone things, right? Like an oratorio or whatever, right? That was composed is kind of like an opera, right? I take it, and it's always performed live, and it was always performed live, and it was written for this highly ritualized setting with, like, okay, this is for a solo performer with an accompaniment, blah blah blah. Yeah, it's absolute. Programmatic is a great word for it. Like, you're like, well, obviously obviously the third movement is a waltz, right? The third movement has to be a dance. And there's this whole aesthetic that has meaning at the time, but we, looking back, can say maybe there were parts of it we like and parts of it we didn't like, and we're free to judge it just as much as it was free to judge things before it. The Romantics released some of those strictures and started to emphasize the free-flowing power of melody more, and that comes to an extreme in Wagner, and that goes directly into metal. There's tons of classical music I enjoy, but it very often is this lofty cognitive pleasure that can be this sort of like, it can be this fine, scintillating thing, but that's not, to me, the heart of music. You can listen to the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and it's fucking sick, or you can listen to just stuff that sounds like the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony all the damn time.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does go in the spirit of extreme metal, which is like, what if we just do the cool part?
Yeah, it's stupid. Like, literally the great theory, certainly most of the aesthetic theorists of classical music, right? Or I'm thinking, especially something a guy in our Discord has talked about, Adorno or whatever, right? These people associate repetition with stupidity,
Mhm.
uh, and with sort of succumbing to the passions and the world of forces. And metal is about the passions and the world of forces. Metal is stupid, right? So it's yeah, how do you translate these amazing melodic and harmonic ideas into a context for idiots like us who want to bang our heads?
Yeah.
Mm.
Fundamentally, that's like that's the question I always ask of these people. Where it's like when I said earlier, it's like, well, the problem with classical music is that it features no slams or sick gutturals.
Yeah.
It's whenever I hear people talk about the relationship between metal and classical, I just want to be, yeah, but which one do you listen to more, and why
Yes,
is that?
I think that's totally fair. You have to be bold enough to own your actual aesthetic preferences. One of my best buds has been really good at pushing me on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, yeah, no, I actually kind of do think metal is better than classical music.
Well,
Like,
yeah,
I'm
I
I'm
mean,
never gonna claim that like Ison is more of a genius than Beethoven, or even that like, I mean, there probably is probably is a greater kind of profundity in the whole capacious world of a Beethoven symphony than there is in a metal record. But like, um, but on the whole, I really think there is something to metal is just better, at least by the requirements of someone like me.
well, yeah, I mean, you've got to get at a certain. I like that idea of like owning your aesthetic preferences, and
Yeah.
because it's like yeah, I like I was thinking about this in terms of
Something has carried forward about classical music for me very immediately, and it's the something I find in metal.
yeah. Well, I was thinking about this in the context of video games the other day.
Mm.
Because I've been playing video games pretty much my whole life, and I'm still really into it. But the way people talk about video games has changed a lot. For instance, so I was reading stuff like Computer Gaming World and PC Gamer, all the like print magazines back in the '90s through the 2000s before most of that evaporated, and when shooters as a genre were really expanding in video games, one of the things that people got really into in the late 90s and early 2000s was about how violent could they be. And
Hmm.
you would have magazine articles where developers would enthusiastically talk about their like gore systems. I remember when Soldier of Fortune came out in like 99 or 2000, being able to shotgun people's limbs off was seen as like like a triumph, and everyone was really stoked about it. Now, nobody will say that out loud. Anytime people talk about like extreme violence in video games, it's always because it has like a message about how bad violence is. But clearly, the aesthetic preference of a lot of people playing these games is, yeah, I want to shotgun a guy's limb off because that's inherently dope. So, why, as a culture, are we denying that aesthetic preference? You'll constantly see these sort of hand-wringing articles in, supposed high art games journalism about it's like, why are video games so violent anyway? And I'm like, dude, you're playing them. Why don't you tell me? Stop
Yeah.
foisting the question off onto everybody else. Why don't you just answer? I like it because it's cool. Like,
What's in the words of Tool? Why can't you just admit it?
yeah, I don't understand. It's like, why is that such a thing? I mean, that's really a conversation in and of itself. Is like this weird disconnect between these obvious base aesthetic preferences that we all
Yeah.
enjoy and these but I don't know, it's wrapped up in some sort of like feeling of personal guilt or something.
Yeah.
I don't
It,
get it.
yeah. In our culture, young men, a part of them, right? Not all of them, right? There's more things to life, but a fundamental instinct in young men is that they want to go to war and to conquer. And they can seek, in our culture, we give them two outlets for that, which are organized sports and video games,
Mhm.
uh, which used to have almost nothing to do with each other, right? Until the Halo moment that bridged them. Um, But yeah, and so you get people who come out one end with who have like real physical capability and high testosterone, but who you know who have the imaginative component or the visionary or almost you could say religious component of their brain turned off. And on the other end you get, sort of weak nerds who spend their time in imaginary universes, right? And the calling of the um as a if you're truly into metal, right, you're it's your job to try to be both.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
But like, yeah, video games are an outlet, like profoundly an outlet for people's innate violent impulses. And why is that bad?
Well, I think that it's part of a broader.
I think you can talk, if you want to talk about a video game that's been really destructive, the video games that are the most destructive. I also think like it definitely is true that they affect people's behavior and have had some really horrible effects on people's behavior. But I'm going to say that some of the absolute worst, the worst violent video games are the ones that make violence most unreal.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, you were going to say something. Go.
Oh no, I was just trying to link this to this broader idea in culture of. I remember we were talking a little while back, and I know that I've talked with Nick from Hessian Firm a little bit about this, but the movies of Craig T. Zoller, Bone Tomahawk, Brawl in Cell Block 99.
Yeah. We were talking about this too.
Yeah. So one thing that I really liked. And I ended up reading an article that sort of echoed some of these same ideas, which is that Craig Zoller makes movies that are devoid of like theme or message. They are pure expressions of creativity. They are a story unadorned with any sort of like morality or philosophy. I mean, I guess there's a sort of very primitive philosophy behind them, which is like they're all stories about men who must go through horrible ordeals to attain what they think is right. But in general, they are devoid of the messaging that we see in nearly everything else in popular culture. And in the same way that...
I think it has a different method. I think it does have an ideology. It's just a primordial warrior ideology.
Yeah,
defend your friends and crush the enemy.
Yeah, it's so primitive, it's like barely even identifiable as like an ideology. But you understand what I mean, a more political motivation.
I guess that's what yes, that's the funny thing. It's that I think people who I think there's such a uniformity of messaging in culture these days, a uniformity of ideology that somebody could look at a movie like Dragged Across Concrete or Bone Tomahawk and be like, this guy doesn't, this is just meaningless violence, right? This guy doesn't, what does this mean, right? There's no morality here.
Yeah, but I think that's interesting because what you detect when people say stuff like that, it's the same it's the same way people react when they're doing like weirdly scathing reviews of that Death Pile record that I talked about on the Power Electronics thing I did, where it's, if they thought it was just meaningless violence, they wouldn't sound so panicked when they talked about it. It's the lack of a simple, easily identifiable moral center that terrifies them. Because I just think every fucking game and movie and everything in popular culture now is no longer about what the plot is about. It's about something else. It's some sort of fucking morality play or Aesop's fable designed to get you to believe that the world is supposed to work in a certain way to reinforce certain ideologies. And I'm not just talking about politics. I'm talking about like baseline moral ideologies. These, multi-$100 million projects that are there to remind you that violence is bad or something, which just seems truly bizarre to me. I don't know. It's something that's I've been running up against in culture a lot.
Something I saw recently. So I hadn't seen Gladiator since I was in middle school.
Rules. Coolest movie ever.
Well, so in middle school, I was too autistic to appreciate it because all I could see was the crushing historical inaccuracy and some of the sort of Hollywood emotional manipulation kind of stuff that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I'm too, fuck this, right? It's like these, and I do think it's an uneven movie. I think there are real questions you can ask about the writing. It seems like there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, sure.
However, it is brilliant.
Yeah,
I watched it. Do you think Satanic War Master got strength and honor from that movie?
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Dude, that is such a 100% metal movie.
Oh my god, it's so metal.
Eclipsed only by 300 a few years later.
Well,
you know?
The 300 is the 300 is the quintessence of metal movie. If you want an underrated Rotting Christ album, Ayalo, I'm almost positive they just decided they were going to write it as a soundtrack to the 300.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It has some not so crypto new metalisms in it. But 300 is amazing. But to me the peak of Gladiator is the scene where he's talking to his owner in his office, right?
Mm-hmm.
And up until this point, you've been like, wow, what kind of gall does this rich merchant have to tell these men how they're going to die or whatever, right? Not to tell them that they're going to die, I guess that's just polite, but to give them these speeches about it, right? You're like, what right does this guy have, right? And then in this conversation, you learn, oh, of course, this guy's an ex-gladiator,
mm-hmm.
right? And the movie up till this point and after it takes the sort of has the expected, as you would say, the expected slant, which is Gladiator bad, right? Like Colosseum bad, right?
Mm.
Obviously, this is the sort of modern secular Christian moral slant. Obviously, Colosseum bad. And in this scene, they're talking man to man, and the gladiator trainer / owner just tells him about being a gladiator. And it's in that moment he says, being a gladiator is the coolest possible thing you could be. Right? Yeah. To die before the people of Rome and your gods is the greatest possible honor. You will achieve transcendent heroism, staking your life every single day. He's seen a religious significance in it. And the movie could ironize this. It could give us the critical turn. Mm. It doesn't.
Yeah.
The music swells, and it is the coolest moment of the soundtrack the entire time, right? I think the entire movie, the coolest soundtrack happens there. And Maximus just he just hears that, and up till then, right, he's been like, I'm a military man, not a gladiator, and my goal is just to get the hell out of here. But at that moment, right, he decides, this is the mask I've been given, I'm gonna wear it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the I think that tendency to ironize is one just like completely endemic in like all culture now,
for sure,
which is awful. But what's interesting is that like no matter how much people attempt to ironize stuff, there's something that there are things even in these ironic portrayals that the audience that it intends to sort of mock sees upon and just love, regardless of its content, because it's like certain ideas have power beyond it. Like a great example is, back when I was in the military, in my age bracket, now guys in their early 30s, back then it was, early 20s, the favorite war movie of everybody in my unit was Black Hawk Down.
Mm-hmm.
And Black Hawk Down is supposed to be a movie about a what is essentially a massive American military failure.
Right.
But the sheer reality of being out there with your bros in a high stakes situation, gunning down hundreds of people, just fucking rules inherently. Or perhaps the greatest example of it of all, because this is a movie that's gone through so many critical reinterpretations and sort of public reinterpretations, would be Starship Troopers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Starship Troopers, is originally made as this sort of parody of fascism and American military venturism and stuff. And people suggest that, when it first came out, people didn't understand that it was supposed to be a parody of those things. No, the public obviously understood that it was supposed to be a parody of those things. But what bothers people is the fact that the parodic essence of it doesn't fucking matter to a lot of young guys that watch it. I love Starship Troopers. And also, I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say kill them all. I don't give a fuck what the plan was behind that movie. What sort of critical apparatus it saw itself as a part of. It fucking rules. And the essence of it carries.
Yeah, that's what depends. I mean, in a culture of this is a exhausted our mainstream culture is exhausted late stage civilization, and I think to parse the things that are good, you almost always have to look for that core that is shining through despite the self-reflexive turns, the ironies, and the all of that. Another really good example is Warhammer.
Yeah.
Really, this applies to all of Warhammer, but the debate happens specifically in 40K. It is true that the original, first edition was this kind of Judge Dredd dystopian comedy, which I suppose it's fair to say, sure, that's kind of parody, right? The Space Marines are super oppressive, but also that was written in the tradition of 80s heavy metal and metal punk aesthetics, like Heavy Metal Magazine and shit, where, yeah, you were supposed to laugh at all the heinous shit they were doing, but it was also super cool, right? And after that, it just, after that, they've always attempted to justify 40K by saying it's parody. Show me where. I mean, we don't rely on what somebody says the art means to interpret the art. We look at the art, and we look at the art, and everyone. This is another good example of you tell me, right? So many people who are deeply invested in Warhammer and 40K or whatever will tell you it's a parody. Do you think it's a parody, man? Don't you think if you didn't think this was cool, you wouldn't have 250 little metal, or I guess these days plastic, Space Marines, right? If you didn't think this was cool and beautiful, and that there was some sort of power and majesty in this story, you would not bother playing this game in the first place. The art speaks to you on an instinctual level, in the language of affect, right? It speaks in the language, it shows you what is cool. And cool is just a word we use for what we value, right? Sorry, bro, you unironically like Warhammer. And if you've played Warhammer ironically the whole time, you are wasting your fucking life. Even more than we do by playing Warhammer. I mean, I don't currently play, but I have, and I'm still invested in the lore. I still follow it.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. That was perfect. I almost reflexively hit the stop button like we do when we're recording the episode, but I probably shouldn't do that for a live stream.
All right. Cool.
Just brutally close the door on the live stream, kick everyone out to think about it, So.
All right, guys. Hey, thanks. Also, before we close out, let's make sure we address any other questions in the chat, at least quick. We'll give ourselves 5 or 10 minutes to do it.
Let's see. I think the only one that sticks out is a guy asked, do we watch any extreme metal themed YouTube accounts? If so, which ones? Okay. Short answer, not really. We developed Terminus because it was the show that we wanted to listen to that didn't exist. Slightly longer answer. A lot of the stuff that Hesh and Firm produces is really cool. The Bunsen Burner podcast is really cool. These are all probably guys that you've heard of that are part of the same network of weird metal autists that we find ourselves in. In general, though, any of the bigger YouTube stuff, I mean, I don't know, Rauda does shit that's cool sometimes.
Rauda has a lot of this stuff is sort of hit or miss, and that's kind of the nature of it because it depends more on the guest or whatever. Rauta's interviews are sometimes really good, and I think if you want a absolute classic interview, his interview with the guy from Archgoat happens outdoors in like a Finnish summer under a blossoming tree. They're drinking beers, and you see him just in like super cool dude mode having a conversation. It's like ASMR. The wind is blowing out the wind is blowing out the mic, so you get like like noise effects. So Route has some cool stuff. I would say Radio Free Innsmouth is very good.
RFI definitely.
Critically minded. That's probably the closest thing to Terminus you could get, aside from Bunsen Burner, which would just be like, I mean, that's just like the same people. Radio Free Innsmouth, he structures his show in a musical analysis way. It's different, right? Because it's sort of, I think his audience is mostly like highly online Zoomers, and he's educating them in the records he loves best. So he'll do like band-oriented features. But he often has quite interesting things to say about the music. He did a German black metal one where he did Bilskirnir and Thanor. Or he did Thanor and Moonblood. Thanor and Moonblood. I hadn't heard anybody talk about Thanor since I wrote a obscure blog review of that 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. He did a good Bilskirnir episode, and he said some smart things about it, including, I remember, just comparing it to a Joy Division bass line, which is like not at all an association I would immediately reach for with Bilskirnir, but like you think about the bass line he's talking about, and it's like, oh yeah, that, you're not wrong, right? So he really is paying attention to musical form, and I think that stuff is good.
He also did a really good episode about Mortician recently. Yeah, it's just like it almost defeats the purpose of me ever doing anything about Mortician on our show, because it would just be the same thing, pretty much. He's really good. But honestly, any of the Scale It Back is really cool.
Scale It Back is cool. Initially, I was not so into it, but that was partly just because he reminded me too much of us when we were younger. Just like really just searingly negative, to the point that it's almost self-undermining.
Yeah.
However, he's sort of really worked hard and revised his approach, and the new stuff is good, right?
I'd also like to say Metal Music Theory is very good if you want something a little bit more academic that's just really into the exact way that a lot of technical metal music is constructed. A lot of it's way over my head, but it's pretty awesome. But yeah, as far as like the big guys, like record review channels, collection channels, we don't really watch any of that.
We don't fuck with that. There's like for each, I guess we both are like sort of we're like passively positive about Wyatt X him. Like he's popularizing it, but like his own interest in the music is obviously sincere. He doesn't hand wring about it or water anything down. He knows his stuff. I think as far as very mainstream stuff, I think his stuff is solid.
He's respectable. It's just, his content is just a little bit too like minimal and straightforward to be of a lot of interest to us. We need people who are on like high test autism.
Yeah. It's the problem of shows like that is that a bunch of people who have no business being interested in this music get into it, but such as, I mean, it's been around 30 fucking years. That's gonna happen. His heart's in the right place, and I'm sure some of those people go on to be total autists, right? So,
Yeah.
Other than that, like, yeah. But aside from that, there's just like a slew of. It's actually really. There's a ton. Every week, I'll just see some new metal YouTuber account, and it's always some guy who has his face on there, which gets more better for the algorithm. And he always has 2,000 subscribers. I feel like that stuff just hits a certain ceiling and goes nowhere, in part because most of those guys are not doing music criticism.
Yeah.
Oh, real quick, there are two other sort of, I guess you should say, like, if you're a collector, neither of us are really interested in the material side of record collecting. I'm into like buying records when I can afford it, which is rarely. But like, if you're interested in the nuts and bolts of record collecting, White Filth is a good channel for that, and he supported Terminus very early on. So
yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah, cool dude. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good roundup, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's just not. I mean, if there is really cool content more in the vein of the stuff that we do, please let us know. You know, I'd be happy to listen to more stuff like that. But it's a very small niche that seems like it's filled pretty quickly with just a handful of like podcasts and stuff. I think that like between us and Bunsen Burner and Hessian Firm, we've got the entire audience that could be interested in this sort of thing. So
yeah, it's and we're working on, what we'll have to do. We're slowly crawling towards we're slouching towards 1,000 subscribers. And if we can we'll see, right? We'll see. We'll start testing the waters of those numbers that other YouTubers end up with, and maybe, just maybe, there are enough autists out there that we can actually carry it further.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. But thanks a lot for coming out to the inaugural live stream, guys. We're gonna try to do these semi-regularly and polish them up a little bit. Like I said up front, this is a first for us, so